We got to start the webinar. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. We're just going to give folks a few seconds. If you need a transcription, please make sure to click the live transcript CC box while we wait. Okay, so let's get started and folks will just join as we get going. Thank you all for joining our webinar today. Today, we're here to talk about our newest report, Prioritizing Financial Security in the Movement to End IPV. Sorry, this is a webinar. We will be together for about an hour and a half, so please take breaks as you need to, get some snacks, get some water, and we will get started. So my name is Tania Ventura. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm the Director of Service Provider Engagement and Education at FreeFrom, and my role in this project was to support with outreach and coordinating all the participants who were part of this study and doing the interviews with folks. I'm gonna let my colleague Kirkley introduce herself.
Hi, everybody. My name is Kirkley Doyle. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am the Director of Data and Research at FreeFrom. It's nice to be here with all of you. My role on this project was to lead on the data analysis for the survey data and the interview data that we collected, and to work on kind of drafting and writing and putting the report together.
Thank you. And then just some housekeeping items. If you need live transcription, you can turn that on by clicking the live transcript box. You can either do the a transcript, so it tells you who's talking when, or you can just do subtitles. We will have opportunities to ask, or y'all will have opportunities to ask questions. We ask that you please use the Q&A box so it doesn't get lost in the chat box. The chat box, we would love for you all to say hi to folks, introduce yourself, where are you joining us from, and then there'll be reflection questions throughout the PowerPoint that y'all can engage in the chat box. So to be clear, the chat box is to talk to each other, connect, answer reflection questions. The Q&A box is specifically for questions. If you accidentally ask a question in the chat box, no worries. We have our colleagues Sharon Lim and Pamela Guerra, who will be kind of managing the Q&A in the chat box for us so that we don't miss anything and answering any questions that are urgent as we're going through the webinar. All right, so next slide, please. So today's agenda, we're going to start off by talking a little bit about the economic burden of IPV, because it really frames a lot of the conversations that we're going to have today. We're going to do a super brief intro to FreeFrom, because I know some of y'all have probably joined a couple webinars and are like, okay, we know who you are, so it'll be very brief. And then we'll jump into the stuff that we're all excited to talk about today. So we'll jump into about this study. We'll go over some participant demographics. Then we'll get into the key findings and the roadmap laid out in the report. We'll finish up with some taking action items and then a Q&A. Next slide, please. And now I'm going to hand it over. Oh, no, not yet. Sorry. And we're going to start with the economic burden of IPV. So this might be a familiar slide, because if you've attended our previous webinars, we tend to talk a lot about this, but it's always a good reminder, especially for folks that are new. So 1 in 4 women and nearly 1 in 2 trans folks experience intimate partner violence in the US. So that's quite a bit of people. And from our work, we know that the #1 obstacle to survivor safety is financial insecurity. And that the CDC estimates that on average, a female survivor the costs that they incur just from being a survivor are about $104,000. $104,000. I cannot talk today, apparently, y'all. And that 99% of survivors experience economic abuse. So all this to say that being subjected to IPV is financially devastating for most people, and survivors can only secure long-term safety for themselves and their children if they can afford to rebuild and heal. Next slide. And this is from this data is from an earlier report that we put out. So there is quite high costs to economic abuse and surviving economic abuse. The survivors that we surveyed in one of our last reports reported that on average, they have about 1,280 stolen from them by the harm doer each month. So that's each month. Think about how much that would be like in a few years or even after. That harm doers restrict survivors' freedom to spend an additional 1,000, almost a little over 1,000 of their own money as they see fit each month. Harm doers incur about $16,000 in coerced or fraudulent debt in a survivor's name each year. That's a lot of money, especially if you're thinking about years kind of piling up on top of each other. They told us that they incur about $17,770 in property damage costs every year, and they lose out on about $23,000 of income every year. So that's quite a lot of money on top of that CDC number of 104K. That survivors are really, in debt, not spending, but like getting spent on their behalf through coerced or fraudulent debt, and just losing out month to month, year to year. Next slide, please. And then, for folks that are Black, Indigenous, POC, and who are LGBTQ+, there's greater obstacles to financial security. So these aren't new stats. I know that we've probably all seen these nationally, but for every $1 white men earn, Asian women earn only 90 cents, Black women earn only 62 cents, Native American women earn only 57 cents, Latinx women earn 54 cents, and for every $1 white men own, Black and Latinx women only own pennies, and Native American women own less than 1/10 of the median wealth of all Americans. So if you are a survivor and you're also BIPOC or LGBTQIA, the financial burden just increases just because of the systemic racism and the systemic financial inequity that exists in our country. Next slide. So before we jump into what we're going to talk about today, we want to do a little pulse check in the chat box. So what comes to mind when you see, read, or hear financial security for survivors? I know it's kind of a mouthful, so we wanted to kind of first get your thoughts about what comes up for you when you see, read, or hear financial security for survivors. Let us know in the chat box. And Sharon, if you can read a few as they start to come in.
We have some people writing just to the panelists. So if you're writing to the whole group, just be sure to make sure that you're typing to panelists and attendees. We're seeing stuff like housing, independence, reliable regular income for survivors, childcare that allows survivors to work, which is a really big one. We're seeing independence again.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. I'm so happy that, some of the stuff that's coming up for you is going to align with the conversations we're going to have today. So please keep thinking about that. And hopefully what you think of will expand, will grow as we continue in today's session. Next slide, please. So a quick intro into FreeFrom. Next slide. The FreeFrom team is made up of queer, trans, immigrant, and BIPOC survivors. We envision a world in which all survivors are able to build the wealth and financial security necessary to support their individual, intergenerational, and community healing, enabling them to thrive. To that end, we take a very holistic approach, aka we do a lot of things, like using technology, peer-to-peer networks, training programs for IPV agencies, policy advocacy, social enterprise models, and cross-sector solutions. And one of the most exciting things that we do is that we walk the walk. We don't just talk it. So next slide, please. So here's a brief overview of FreeFrom's benefits. So we take creating survivor-centered workplaces very seriously. So when we talk about creating wealth and healing opportunities for survivors, we're also talking about the survivors and our staff. So these are just a few of our benefits that allow us to really embody that mission. So we have a bring your kids to work policy. We have 100% covered health, vision, and dental insurance. We have unlimited menstrual leave, gender-based violence paid and protected leave, so on and so forth. If any of you are curious to learn more about this, there is a recorded webinar just on this. So definitely check out our YouTube channel to learn more about how we got to these benefits. Next slide. And now for real, I'm going to hand it over to Kirkley.
Hi, everybody. Okay, so I'm just going to share a little bit of background about this particular study, which was the basis for the report that we're covering today. So the goal of this report, and I'll just read it to you, it was to eliminate what will enable staff working in the intimate partner violence movement to prioritize client economic security, and from there provide a roadmap for what building financial work could look like. And so we really had the idea for this study for a couple things that we kind of knew from our work. And the first was that we were aware, sort of anecdotally, through our work supporting service providers in the IPV movement, that it's the number one barrier to the number one barrier to safety for survivors is financial security. So we knew this through our work from survivors in our network, as well as our work supporting the movement. But we wanted to understand why it can sometimes be a challenge to incorporate financial security building work into the movement. And so we're all sort of aware of this issue. We wanted to understand more from those really doing the work, what they needed in order to really incorporate financial security building work into their support of clients. And then we also knew that many of the folks that we support who are working in the movement are survivors themselves, experiencing similar or the same financial challenges as the clients they're supporting. And yet there was not a lot of data on the survivor service provider experience. And so these are things we knew in our work, but we wanted to sort of bring to the forefront and work with the folks who are really doing the work to understand more about these aspects and be able to provide some data to start more conversations around them. So this was the basis of our study. And this is just a quote kind of illustrating those points from someone who participated in the study. So they said, here at the emergency shelter, we have 30 to 45 days, 3 months tops, to try to get someone to increase their income to be able to afford and make 3 times the rent, because that's what landlords are asking. And that's ridiculous. I don't even make 3 times the rent. So this is from a service provider who participated in this study. So to share a little more detail, we surveyed 52 staff and conducted hour-long in-depth interviews with 50 staff. This was from part-time hotline staff and folks doing part-time direct service work all the way up to executive directors. And we did this with folks from 11 different IPV organizations in both Los Angeles and Orange counties. These organizations provide a range of different services, including shelter, transitional housing, hotline, and drop-in services. So it's a pretty good snapshot of the Southern California IPV organizations that we included in this project. And then we just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the participants who shared with us. The survey that folks filled out was pretty substantial, and they spent at least an hour. Some folks spent a little bit more time with us, sharing their experiences, sharing about their work, sharing about their efforts to support clients, their own financial circumstances and what they need. And we just wanted to take a moment here with all of you today to really acknowledge that work that went into creating the data that goes into this report, and just to support and be grateful for the work that service providers everywhere are doing every single day. And we also, just as a note, we felt it was really important to compensate folks for their time. And so all the participants in the study were paid $100 for their time, both filling out a survey and speaking with Tanya and our colleague Em, who also conducted interviews. And then also just a quick note to our partners in this endeavor. So the Community Investment for Families Department, formerly known as HSID LA, was a main partner in helping us kind of get this study together. And then California State University Long Beach, we had a professor and a graduate student who were intimately involved in helping us kind of craft the data analysis strategy. And then Citi was our funder for this project. Okay, so now that you have a little bit of a landscape of the study, I can share a little bit more about some of the participants specifically that contributed to this data. So as I mentioned, we had a range of staff members. It was all the way from direct service staff, part-time folks, people working on the hotline, all the way up to executive level staff. And this is just a breakdown so that you can get a sense of kind of the percentage of different folks who participated in the study. And we used these 4 categories by title that we grouped into direct service staff, managers, directors and associate directors, and executive level staff. And throughout some of our analysis, we looked at, what was the case for direct service staff, say, compared to executive level staff on things like compensation, benefits, and things. So this is sort of a landscape, but also something we used in order to conduct analyses so that you're all familiar as you're hearing the results through the study. Okay, and then to give you a quick sense of some demographics. So age, we had folks from 22 all the way up to 65 with an average age of about 35 for our participants. And I'm going to go through these demographics figures a little bit quickly, but they are all in the report. I don't know, Sharon, if you, or Pam, if you can drop the link to the report, if you haven't already, into the chat. If folks want to look at these, they are available, but I'm just going to breeze through them a little bit quickly. And this is a sense of gender and sexuality. So overwhelmingly, participants in the study identified as women and heterosexual. In terms of race and ethnicity, overwhelmingly participants identified as Latinx, 81.3% of participants, and just to give a sense of immigration status as well, and 84.3% identifying as non-immigrants. And then, actually, sorry, I'm gonna go back. I want to say one more thing, just to touch on this, to bring up something that Tanya talked about earlier in the slide, is that, as we are talking about the workplace and the experience of survivor service providers, and we're going to share some information about sort of compensation and things, and that, as Tanya shared, that Latinx women on average make 54 cents on the dollar compared to white men, and statistics suggest that over a lifetime, they'll lose out on over $1 million of wealth due to wage gaps. And so as we're thinking about some of the findings that are coming through this study about how we can be better supporting service providers, and especially service providers who are survivors, thinking about these sort of intersecting things with this particular population that we're presenting on today are really, really important. And then lastly, just to share a little bit about education, as you can see, the overwhelming percent of staff completed either a bachelor's or a master's degree, with 1/3 of staff completing an advanced degree. And so Tanya will share some statistics and things from our sample about debt burdens and just thinking about how do we help build wealth and address things like student loan debt in the movement, thinking about this particular population and the educational credentials that they have as we're thinking through this data. Okay, so that's a little bit about the study and the demographics of our particular population. And then I'm going to just jump into some of our key findings before handing it back to Tanya to go over our sort of roadmap coming out of the data that we collected in this report. So we had 4 key findings, and I'm just going to pause for a minute on this slide. Feel free to take a screenshot if it's helpful to have, but I'll just pause so that we can read through these, as they're pretty critical and will guide sort of be the bones for the rest of the presentation. So our first key finding was that staff working in the IPV movement are not able to support clients in building financial security as much as they would like, but given the opportunity, they have very clear ideas of what more they could do and a willingness to do it. And so this really gets at the goal of the report I was sort of shared earlier, which is that service providers are in the work every day and they really know what's best and know what's needed. And that was the whole basis for this report, is that we really wanted to hear from the folks doing the work every day, what the support they need in order to be able to to do income building and financial security work with their clients. So there's a real sort of willingness to do it and things that they want to do if given the opportunity and the support. The second is key obstacles to prioritizing financial security at an organizational level revolve around a lack of flexible funding. Funding specifically for financial work with clients and training staff is needed, along with more unrestricted funding to foster greater innovation. So this is something we heard over and over again, and Tanya will share some more details. But this is both flexible funding for the organizational level, so that organizations are able to innovate and pivot and provide the work that service providers are really identifying that their clients need, and also unrestricted cash to give to clients to be able to spend as clients see fit. So it's sort of two-pronged there, but a really important theme that came up again and again in the report. The third key finding is that key obstacles to individual staff doing more financial work are a lack of training and financial education and the need for greater financial security themselves. Staff felt ill-equipped to teach what they have not experienced. So that gets back to that quote I shared earlier, and we have a few more examples of this throughout the report about staff feeling like they are trying to help clients achieve a benchmark like making 3 times the rent when they themselves are not experiencing that. So this was another really critical finding from this study. And then lastly, prioritizing financial security in the movement requires meaningful investment in staff well-being. We must begin by acknowledging that many staff not only experience financial insecurity, but also identify as survivors. And so really breaking down that, one thing we really tried to be intentional when this report, both in the webinar and authoring the report itself, was not to say staff and survivors, but staff and clients, in order to really be including staff when we're talking about survivors and really acknowledging that. So these are kind of the 4 key findings. Hopefully everybody got a chance to read those. Again, feel free to take a screenshot if it's helpful. And I'm going to hand it back to Tanya, if I can find my mouse, to share some more of our roadmap.
Thanks, Kirkley. Always does such a great job with all that stuff. So I do want to acknowledge that some of that stuff that Kirkley was just mentioning, if we have service providers on the call, might feel really reflective of your own experience. So we're going to continue to talk more about what service providers are experiencing, what they're telling us. If at any point it makes you start feeling uncomfortable, if it brings up anything for you, please feel free to take care of yourself in whatever way you need to. This session will be recorded. PowerPoint slides will be given to you afterwards. So definitely don't feel bad if you got to jump off or things start coming up and you just can't be here. But we're going to jump into expanding and enhancing financial work with survivors. So this section is really about the current work that's being done and the ideas that service providers had around how we can expand and enhance this work. So next slide, please. So the first thing that we're going to jump into is we asked service providers what are the top financial needs that they are hearing from the survivors that they work with. So these are their clients. The number one financial need that came up time and time again was building income. So that means that service providers were seeing their clients have a lot of challenges with building income, and we'll get into a few examples of what those are. The next was budgeting, and we use the word budgeting just because it was a word that most people understood and could resonate with, but really it's more about like money management. So survivors are having challenges with managing the money that they do have. The third was managing debt. So this is, paying debt, paying off debt, understanding how much debt they have, even, to the last point, getting into some credit issues. Then it was building savings. That was pretty self-explanatory. So challenges with having savings to tap into when something happens. And the fifth was building and repairing credit score, which completely makes sense because if you don't have income, you kind of can't do any of the others, right? So if you don't have income, you don't have money to manage, first of all, so you can't really budget your way out of poverty. Debt is going to be harder to pay off if you don't have income. Savings are going to be harder to access and save up if you don't have income. And of course, repairing your credit is kind of going to be like all the way at the end just because of this income challenge. So it made sense to us why we saw building income as the number one need. Next slide. And then we got curious about, well, what is happening now? And we asked service providers to share a little bit about what financial work they were currently doing with survivors. On average, no clients were assisted with, like, I will read this for y'all, but let me know if I'm reading too slow, but identity fraud, support for gig or contract work, small business education, business planning, permits, licenses, or other startup business legal support. On average, a few clients were assisted with saving, building a savings plan, opening a checking or savings account, credit building or repairing, paying down debt, resume building, work readiness, searching for a job, applying for a job. And on average, some clients were assisted with financial literacy and budgeting. So I think the important thing here to understand is that almost nobody reported supporting all clients with financial work. So this means that very little financial work is being done with survivors. So we got really curious to know, it sounds like service providers understand that survivors have financial needs, but for some reason, the ability to provide that financial support is mismatched, right? So there's a mismatch happening here. To us, maybe a little bit of a disconnect between what survivors are needing and what service providers and agencies are able to provide. And we got more curious as to why that was happening and how we can support service providers. So we'll share a little quote next slide. There's a lot of career development. A lot of clients want to go back to school or want to start exploring other work options. What I do with participants is just give them options as far as employment. For instance, always advising, encouraging, not enforcing to stop by a work agency. If they need help with the paperwork, if they need help with the resume, if they need help filling out a work application, that's a service that I do with them. So this is a service provider that shared a little bit about what they were doing currently. Next slide. And like I said, we got curious about, what are the challenges that in this space, specifically with income building. So I think we're only going to go into income building, but you can read the report to really get some more information about all the other pieces that were outlined in that first slide. Some key challenges were that clients were not able to work. So a lot of, well, I shouldn't say a lot of, but a few agencies had policies where if you were living in shelter, you were not allowed to work. So that was a huge barrier to survivors being able to access income and then therefore do all the other things that were on that list. Lack of reliable transportation really hindered survivors' ability to get jobs or to get to work or to even go to interviews. So that was another big barrier that service providers shared with us. Lack of job history. So we know that a key component of economic abuse is restricting somebody's ability to make income, which includes not allowing them to work, includes a harm doer not allowing a survivor to work, or maybe sabotaging a work thing, or causing so many problems with their job that they have no other option but to quit or to get fired. So it makes sense that lack of job history is going to make it more difficult for survivors to access traditional income and employment. The other is lack of childcare. So survivors that were working with the service providers that we talked to oftentimes fled with their children or left a harmful situation with their children, but now don't have childcare. And as you can imagine, during the pandemic, it made it even harder to seek employment when you have your children with you all the time. They're in school at your home, but even beyond the pandemic, just lack of childcare seemed to be a very big challenge for survivors' ability to acquire income. And then there was additional barriers for folks who are undocumented or awaiting work permits. So we thought it was important enough to highlight because it came up a lot with the service providers that we're working with. So as you can imagine, folks who are undocumented have to go through even more struggles to earn income, just because there's a lot of misconceptions, a lot of fear around what can you do while you're awaiting a work permit or while you're awaiting a visa or whatever it may be that person is waiting for. Or if you're just going to be undocumented, what are the legal avenues to income available to you? And a lot of service providers didn't know what to do in those instances or didn't know how to support folks who are undocumented create income. And this is a quote from somebody who participated in the study. Our agency doesn't allow clients to work due to confidentiality and stuff like that. I personally don't agree with it, but I can understand why. That also makes it very hard to teach clients how to save money when they're not allowed to go out and make any. So that kind of highlights how like income really is a barrier to a lot of those other financial needs that service providers outline for us. Next slide. So they also had great recommendations about what to do in this space, right? If given the opportunity. And I think that that's one of the key findings that I think was really exciting to kind of see, like, yes, we know that there are these challenges, but we also have these incredible ideas to help service providers and survivors that we work with really overcome some of these income challenges. So some of these are, number one was allowing survivors to determine for themselves if it was safe for them to work. So removing those restrictions on work in shelter places or in like programs where you're not allowed to work to be able to receive services. So that was one idea that service providers had, is just putting that choice back onto the survivor. And I think it's a great way to really allow survivors to practice their ability to make their own decisions, especially when it comes to money. Second is providing clients with microloans to advance their professional skills. So that's a great one, right? That was like, yeah, that's so great. Like some may want to like go to beauty school, or some may want to go back to school and get a degree that's going to help them get the job of their dreams, and so on and so forth. So having microloans that allows them to do that would be incredible. And I think really rewarding for a lot of the folks that are supported by service providers. Number three, creating partnerships with local organizations to hire survivors. So some sort of like work placement type of program. Intensive job training program. So it's a little bit different than professional skills. So that means that they would bring it in-house and do some sort of job training with the clients that they're working with. 5, bringing back former participants to mentor current clients about building income. That sounds super cool. And I think that that's important because now you're creating community and collective power among survivors. So survivors supporting survivors, and survivors are going to have an insight into what it's like building income when you're in shelter or when you're in transitional housing in a way that maybe us service providers won't. Number 6 is more tools to support clients interested in starting and or growing a small business. So small business creation was a big solution to a lot of folks who are undocumented, because starting a business is a legal avenue to income for folks who are undocumented. So making sure that you are also supporting those who want to start small businesses or want to work for themselves is a great way to support survivors build income. And the last is paying for childcare for clients so that they can take the time they need to find a job or to work or to go to interviews, so on and so forth. So that's a very simple one, but an important one as well. And then a service provider here shared that we were recently looking into partnering with a nail salon. It's a nail salon that has a school, and it's like a training school. But what would it be like to help people invest in themselves? What are the tools that you might need to be able to do whatever profession that you want? Again, something that would be available to undocumented and documented individuals. So this person had an idea of partnering with a nail salon and making that training available to folks who are undocumented and documented so that they can go off and maybe start their own nail businesses. Next slide. So how to best provide financial services and support. So these are some of the suggestions that service providers shared with us. So starting financial programming right away, as soon as you can with somebody is essential. Like in one of the first quotes that was shared in this webinar, some people only have 30 or 40 days with the client. So starting as early as you can makes a huge difference. Tailoring programming to survivors' individual needs. So instead of making everything prescribed, like, okay, we're going to do a budget. Okay, we're going to, do this and that and that. Understanding that every survivor is going to be in a different place with their financial journey and really making that financial support tailored to them and their needs. Offering services in a number of languages was important, especially when it comes to money, because money in different languages and in different countries just has different implications, and financial systems are completely different. So really offering language specific support can be really meaningful when it comes to financial work with survivors. And having facilitators who are trauma-informed and versed in survivor experience. So this really came about because there was mixed reviews among whether it makes sense to bring in partners to do like financial literacy courses or to do financial coaching, all that type of stuff. Some service providers shared that it was great and it really worked out for their clients. Others said, you know, those people were really disconnected from the survivor experience, and the folks that we work with unfortunately didn't find much meaning or value in it. So I think an important thing that they all pointed out is that it's important to have, if you partner with somebody, that those facilitators understand the survivor experience and are able to tailor their curriculum or their work to really be trauma informed and meet survivors where they're at in their journey with healing. So that's, I think, an important thing to think about when you're partnering with an external partner on financial services. So being trauma informed is really being understanding and not giving them any judgment whatsoever about what's happened, even if they feel like their expenses were their fault or if their credit's bad because of something they did. I like to keep clients in the present and just be, how can we fix it now? So that's a really good example of a service provider who is really making this type of support meaningful in a great way to just really focus on the now and really move away from judgment or the you should or you could or, you know, all those prescribed forms of financial support, and really just focusing on where the survivor is at now and what can we do now together. Next slide. So now I would love to hear from y'all. Do you have any examples of doing financial security work with survivors that you can share in the chat? And it doesn't have to be about income. It can be about any of the others. So it could be about budgeting, managing debt, building savings, or building and repairing credit scores. So anything that y'all are finding that has really been supportive and helpful in your work with survivors, we'd love to hear from you. And I'll give y'all like a minute to think about it and write it, and then Sharon, you can jump in and share some.
We have a response from Stephanie that talks about credit repair. I'm going to read it for folks who can't see. It says, credit repair for survivors with severe debt from abusers has been helpful in a limited way. Microloans, when I worked in a city that had those, made a huge difference for affording a way to move out or away. Advocating for childcare vouchers was probably the most impactful. So it sounds like credit repair and childcare. Also looking at savings matching program and the NNEDV microloan independence program.
Very cool. So it sounds like y'all are aligning with the service providers that we interviewed and had the pleasure of getting to know. I love, love, love hearing about all your ideas. Please keep sharing them in the chat. Like, y'all are the experts in this work. Y'all know what works best for clients and about all the, you know, creative ways to support them. So please, I encourage you to support each other and share with each other in the chat so that folks who maybe are feeling a little stuck in this area can get some ideas. Okay, next slide. So how to prioritize prioritize client financial security. So this is the piece specifically about, you know, how can we as an agency, as individuals, prioritize doing this kind of work with our clients. Next slide, please. So when we asked service providers, what do you think your organization needs, and what are your individual needs as a service provider in order to be able to prioritize financial security? So this means what needs to happen at the organization level, at the individual level, to be able to do this type of work with clients. So as you can remember, we asked them, do your clients have financial needs? Yes, the number one was income building. But when we asked them, what work were you doing? Not a lot of financial work was actually being done with clients. So this is really getting into the why that's happening. And they were able to tell us that their number one need was training and resources on assisting clients with income building, debt management, and credit repair. Number two was increased personal financial security. So this means that individuals needed their own financial security to be at better, or their own financial challenges were getting in their way of their ability to supporting survivors. Number three was coaching or professional development. And tied for fourth was intake questions about each client's financial situation and need, and a lighter caseload. Next slide. And these are the organizational changes. So as an organization, what needs to change or what needs to happen in order for your agency to be able to prioritize client financial security? The number one need that came up here was more funding, specifically targeted for the financial security of clients. So that means that funding that specifically is dedicated to financial work with clients. Number two was training and resources for staff, which we learned a little bit about when we asked for the individuals. Number three was greater financial security for staff. So again, pretty high up there. So not only are our staff identifying this for themselves, but they're also identifying that this is an organizational need. Number four was more flexible funding. So this means larger percentages of your budget allocated towards general operating costs. And the reason why when we asked to learn more about that, it was because, and I think Kirkley shared a little bit, that sometimes financial restrictions that come from the funder can really get in the way about what kind of work you can do, what kind of support you can do. And that includes how flexible the grants that you're able to give survivors that you're working with are, or how restrictive they are. Like, do you need receipts? Do you need to pay for it first and then you get reimbursed, so on and so forth. So it wasn't just flexible funding for the agency themselves, but also how that flexible funding kind of trickles into flexible services for the folks that they were supporting. Number five was a connection to a wider community of organizations and partners helping survivors build financial security. So that's why we want y'all to use the chat to support each other and create community with each other. Number six is funding to hire a dedicated team of financial experts to run a financial empowerment program. Number seven, the ability to comfortably and confidently refer clients elsewhere to receive assistance building long-term financial security. And number eight is more staff. So I think something that's really interesting here is that folks were not telling us we need more staff, and they weren't saying we want to partner with external. I think what I'm seeing here is that folks want to do this work. They just, need a little bit more financial support, both for themselves and the organization, and resources and training to be able to do this work. So I think that was a really interesting finding for me and important to name. Next slide. So when it comes to recommendations from the field, they were recommending financial education and training around financial security building. So there is some out there, but I think one of the biggest needs that they specifically named is that a lot of the financial education and training out there, isn't covered by their current funding. So their funding doesn't allow for much of that to happen. And B, it's not specific to the survivor experience. So when they were talking about, the partners that they've brought in and just how difficult it can be to translate what is found in like typical financial literacy, it's very difficult to translate it into the survivor experience. So really thinking about, survivor-centered financial education and training was important. They for sure made the connection between more funding equals expanding and enhancing services. So obviously more funding is gonna support very innovative and creative solutions, and more flexible funding, which is the next one. And unrestricted funding really allows folks to get creative and to really meet the needs of the survivors versus trying to fit, prescribed ways of funding. So like checking boxes or, making sure that, funding is done in a very specific way that is required by the funder, so on and so forth. And really this came from us learning that 52 to 75% of all the agencies that participated were funded their primary funder was the government. So that's a big chunk, and we know that government funding can be very restrictive. That's important to know. So we need to shift away from the constraints of the traditional grant process towards more flexible funding with fewer restrictions and requirements. And staff knowledge and expertise should drive client services, making room for innovation around survivors' financial security. And this is a great quote that I think it illustrates that. I think one difficulty is that our main revenue source is from the government contracts. And definitely there isn't any opportunity to plan for the future or have the opportunity to even build a reserve a little bit, because it's based on invoice format where you could only invoice the expenses that we incur. So as you can imagine, and I'm sure many of y'all are in this position, it's like, it's very difficult to get creative or to think about, the future of this work when you don't even know if you're going to have the funding next month or in a few months or so on and so forth. So you're very much like, just like, okay, how can we use this money right now, and like getting stuck in the right now. And it can be difficult to kind of zoom out and really think about like, how can we really meet the folks that we're working with and their needs. Next slide. So another question for y'all. And again, I'm going to give you about a minute to think about it and respond in the chat, and then we'll read out. So how does funding impact your ability to do financial security work with survivors, if at all? So how does funding impact your work with survivors, specifically around the financial security space, if at all? So I'll give you a minute to type and think about it, and then Sharon will read some responses.
So some of the responses that we're getting is that there is really no specific funding set aside in this area, which limits the work that service providers can do, which we hear a lot. We're also hearing that that it's hard to show that it's working, especially when these grants expect, progress and data. And we know that this is not an issue that can be solved in, a year or two, whatever the grant period may be. And then also, Anna said, it's very challenging to do income building work, to be able to afford something like this herself. How can you go out and get a job if you can't see clearly? So working with and referring to a survivor who needs a new pair of glasses, and how difficult it can be to make that purchase of glasses when it's a medical need, and how it affects her ability to create income.
Thank you so much. And yeah, those are like a lot of the similar stories that we heard from the service providers that participated in this study. And I think it's important to name that funding is a big challenge here, because it'll help in our advocacy efforts. And as we think about, what do we do from here to really support the movement, prioritize financial security. Next slide. So talking about, some of the needs and challenges with doing this work, as Kirkley mentioned in the key findings, we learned that there are quite a few survivors working in the movement, and that financial security for the staff working was one, like many times cited as a challenge to being able to prioritize financial security with clients. And the reason for that is because 1 in 2 of the staff members that participated identified as a survivor. 1 in 4 staff who identified as survivors reported still being in contact with their harm doer. And 1 in 5 staff members do not feel completely safe at home. So I think this really illustrates that there are survivors still working in the movement. There are survivors who are not safe working in the movement, or there are survivors who are still, there's potential for things to come up when it comes to the relationship that they have with their harm doer. So I think that's important to really center the piece of the conversation when we're talking about, you know, the financial security of the folks working in the IPV movement. Next slide. And this is just to give you an example of all the types of harm that staff were subjected to and that they self-reported. So many of them had overlapping different types of harm. So it wasn't just like they just were a survivor of one thing, they were a survivor of different things. I won't get into all the different percentages, but I think the top two were witnessing parental domestic abuse and personally experiencing intimate partner violence. So those were some of the top types of harm that were experienced among staff. Next slide. So a necessary truth then becomes that we need to acknowledge survivors on staff. Next slide. So what is this financial insecurity that folks were hinting to and were very explicitly talking to us about? So economic abuse is a big one. So among those who shared, two-thirds of all the staff that were comfortable sharing had been subjected to economic abuse. So if you think about it, that can be more than the folks who are just experiencing IPD, right? So that was 1 and 2. The financial well-being among staff was pretty alarming. So 47% of the direct service staff and managers and supervisors have a CFPB score of 50 or less, which is associated with a high probability of struggling to make ends meet. So that means that about half of all the folks we talked to had a high probability of struggling to make ends meet. And the CFPB score is it's a set of questions that has been tested nationally among different populations that can be used to measure probability of financial struggles and just overall financial well-being of folks. So that's what we used when we were asking service providers about their well-being. We also learned that low wages threaten safety. So on average, none of the staff in the study made enough to take care of themselves and a child. And we'll get into a little bit more about those specifics in a bit. And how does this impact the work with clients? Some staff shared how their own experiences as survivors help them relate to the survivors they work with, while others express feeling insecure or like an imposter when trying to do financial work with survivors. Next slide. So staff working in the movement have not escaped the burden of financial insecurity, despite the fact that they are all employed. The reality is that staff and clients face many of the same financial barriers. So we had to ask ourselves, and I invite all of us on this webinar to ask ourselves, how can clients ever get the financial support they need when their service providers are financially vulnerable themselves? It's a big question, right? And a tough one to sit with. But I think it was a question that kept coming up as we talked to more and more service providers. Next slide. So this, I think, is a really important quote, so I'll read it all. So it's one of those, I think you should help yourself before you help others. I feel hypocritical. I have this huge debt over my head, and yet I'm talking to clients about being able to manage their budget, program fees are due, and all these other things. So I really feel hypocritical, and I'm not even living the walk. Holding the clients to a different standard just doesn't feel right. Next slide. So this one's going to be a little bit more personal, and you don't have to write this one in the chat, but hopefully some folks are comfortable sharing in the chat, because I think it really helps us all kind of connect over our survivor experiences and working in the movement. But how does your survivor experience and your relationship to money show up in your work, if at all? So I'll give you a minute to think about it, and then you can type it in and we'll do some share outs. Sharon, do you want to read out a few if there are any?
Yeah, it's a lot of the consensus is people who have had experiences for themselves and seeing it in their clients. So budgeting and trying to make ends meet, people who's had experiences with their parents and childhood, which we see a lot. Definitely feel the imposter syndrome for a lot of folks. People who have had identity theft for themselves and didn't realize it was too late, and then figuring out how do you support folks monitor their own credit, even if they don't have credit cards, and budgeting and tempering needs versus want with children and the guilt that often comes with it.
Thank you. All right, so let's move on. So this is the exciting part for me. Because I think it really helps us envision what the movement could be. And this is all thanks to all the service providers who had great ideas about how we can make movement jobs livable and sustainable. So next slide. So the unfortunate thing was that the average salary reported by staff was about $35,436 after taxes. So this means that on average, none of the staff in our study currently earn enough to support themselves and a child. And I'll get into what living wage at the time that we did the study was in the counties that we surveyed folks in. Next slide. So compensation, the challenges that come with that. So high staff turnover. So a lot of service providers directly linked wages to high staff turnover. One of them even shared, how like in the first year, almost everybody left because of the salaries. So that really makes the movement not sustainable. So that means that we're constantly losing great people because we're not paying them enough. So it makes, we spend a lot of time retraining, we spend a lot of time just reinventing the wheel, when if we just paid staff well, then we'd keep great people, and maybe the momentum of the movement would be far along than it actually is right now. The next is that the myth that care work equals low wage work. So it was not uncommon for us to hear, I'm passionate about this work and that's why I'm doing it. Or, I'm not in this for the money. But why is it that in our society, care work has often so many times been associated with low wage work, when in fact this work is very meaningful and is very impactful and important, and therefore care work deserves the compensation that any other job would. Then there's the racial and wage gaps that Kirkley alluded to earlier in the presentation. So a lot of the folks that participated identified as women, and the majority were Latinx. So now we're getting into, okay, well, if most folks in this movement are BIPOC and identify as women or femmes, then we also got to think about, are we contributing to the racial and wage gaps by, keeping salaries so low? So that's an important thing to mention and to really name here. And when we asked, how are salaries determined at your agency, the number one thing that folks reported was making them comparable to other agencies, which ended up being that comparing salaries to other agencies is a zero-sum game, because guess what? We're not doing that great here. So comparing it to other folks that are also, paying poverty wages and really not looking at the racial and wage gaps that they're contributing to, it's like we're not very, very great agencies to be comparing each other to. So that's something to think about when you're thinking about how do we determine salaries? And then that funders really need to take the lead here. So I think some folks felt like they needed that permission from funders, because funders can be very critical about what you're paying your staff. So it's really going to take a lot of funders education and funders leading in this space to get agencies to feel comfortable with raising their salaries, and really thinking about, how can we make our agencies more sustainable when it comes to salaries and compensation. So the chronic low pay of staff in the intimate partner violence movement is indicative of a core issue. Despite the high societal cost of this systemic issue, society undervalues those who support survivors and disrupt the cycle of violence. So even though we all know this work is important, even though we all know that this is a systemic economic issue, for some reason, our society has not yet valued it in the way that it needs to. So this is going to be a systemic problem that all of us are going to have to get involved in and really do a lot of advocacy to kind of change the way that our society thinks and looks at this at IPB. So next slide. So some recommendations. So I think my funnest question to ask folks in the interview, what is your dream salary, right? So I loved asking that question. And some folks, were like, oh, I don't want to say, because I'm nervous about it. So folks were like, I got it, here's the number, right? But for the most part, the average dream salary was $67,653, which if you look at the living wages, and we use the MIT living wage calculator, in LA County and Orange County, which is where the participants were mostly from. In LA, a living wage after taxes was 65,000 or 65,208. And in Orange County, it was 69,914, which isn't that far off from people's dream salary, right? So which means that service providers really understand and know what they need to live a happy, safe life, even without looking at the MIT salary calculator. So I think that this really, to us, was exciting because it shows that survivors know what they need, especially survivors who are staff know what they need when it comes to the work environment that is beneficial to them. So here's the quote that I was mentioning earlier. So I think in the first 5 months I was there, probably 1/3 to 2/3 of our organization turned over. So many people quit. So many people are hired. It's just the nature of this work. Having another job on top of this is not sustainable whatsoever. It's just going to burn people out and keep people away from the work because it feels like a tornado of everything. It's sad. So we also spoke to a few who had 2 jobs. So in the daytime, they were working at one shelter, and at nighttime, they were working at another. And I think that's what this person was pointing to, that they know that a lot of the folks that work in this movement have to have 2 jobs in order to sustain themselves. And that, leads to a lot of burnout and leads to a lot of emotional distress as well. Next slide. So but the ideas, this is the exciting part, right? So how can we create survivor-centered workplaces? So more comprehensive benefit coverages, including for part-time staff and family members. So we heard from quite a bit of service providers who talked about how just having even something as simple as 100% covered health insurance would be extremely beneficial. And just having not to worry about contributing every month to your insurance would be super helpful. Ample paid time off so that they can take care of themselves and their families. Flexible schedules and lighter caseloads. So that was one of the things that would probably require them to work with their team, their supervisors, and it's going to be a really collaborative effort to make that happen. But having conversations regularly about how can we support you in your caseload? How can we move things around? What's important right now? What can be pushed later? Were all really great ideas about how to support folks who felt overwhelmed with their caseload. And then an open and supportive culture for survivors on staff. So a lot of survivors on staff felt like they couldn't be open about being a survivor, either because of, things folks would say in the hiring process about, ooh, that person just came out of the relationship. I don't know if they'd be great for this job. And, as a survivor hearing that, you're like, oh, maybe I shouldn't disclose that I'm a survivor. So really, they were wanting to have a more supportive and open culture where they could disclose that they're a survivor if they're comfortable, but also feel supported in the benefits that they have and the structure that they have. So some of the things that they specifically talked about was flexibility in their work schedule. So being able to work from home whenever they could, which I think we learned in the pandemic is totally doable, and being able to have more flexible schedules and stuff like that. Support with safety. So if something arises, they want to be able to know that they can go to their employer and they can get support to stay safe. So that the agency has some sort of plan to keep that person safe, as well as taking paid time off if needed, to support their safety. And then access to services. So a lot of them talked about how they would really benefit from the services that are available to their clients, and how it would be really beneficial to them to be able to access those, whether it's at their own agency or in partnership with other agencies in their area. So this, I'm going to read this quote really quick. It can really be an asset for an agency to have survivor voices on staff, and certainly in leadership, because it helps shape organizational policy in so many things. The voices of low-income survivors of domestic violence, who are the bulk of survivors of domestic violence, sometimes get shut out of those conversations and therefore decision making. So I think this really illustrates that survivors on staff are you know, our special sauce. Like, it's what makes this movement so beautiful and brings a lot of passion to the work that we do. But also, we have to be supportive of those survivors on staff and really be intentional about how we can create financial security and safety for them. Next slide. Staff working in the movement to end intimate partner violence are an unmatched resource in our collective efforts to end the cycle of violence in the US. Yet staff in the IPV movement historically haven't been valued or supported at the level they should, creating a situation where jobs in the field are unsustainable and in some cases harmful for staff who are survivors themselves. So it's going to take everyone, especially funders and policymakers, to ensure a truly survivor-centered movement and to make investments to bring these ideas into reality. Next slide. Okay, so now that y'all learned about all the exciting ideas that folks had, how would a survivor-centered workplace impact your work? So let's say you had your dream salaries and they were living wages. Let's say you had ample PTO. Let's say you had 100% covered health insurance, vision, and all that. Let's say that you felt comfortable enough to disclose that you're a survivor and know that you would be supported and receive the services that you need. What impact would that have on your work? So I'll give you a minute to think about it and put some responses in the chat. I think we're being shy, maybe, in the chat box. It's okay. I know that we're inching towards the 1 hour and a half, but I hope that you have a moment to envision a survivor-centered workplace and how that would impact your life or your work. And we're going to jump into some take action steps. So hopefully it helps make that dream a little bit more realistic for us all. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's get into what do we do with all this? What comes next for all of us? Next slide. So I got some more questions for y'all, but it sounds like, you know, we're getting a little shy, but hopefully we can share, because like I said, y'all have so much important knowledge that I love to hear, and I think other folks can really benefit from. So here are 3 questions. You don't have to respond to all of them. You can respond to whichever one is really calling you to think about and respond to. But what are some recommendations you are excited and ready to incorporate? What are some challenges to incorporating these recommendations? What are some strategies that can help with these challenges? So the first is recommendations you're excited to incorporate. The second is challenges that you perceive could happen as you're trying to incorporate these. And what are some strategies that can help overcome these challenges? So answer whichever one you want in the chat. And feel free to support each other in the chat. Like if someone has a challenge that they're sharing and you have an idea, feel free to support each other. Do we have any to read, Sharon?
Yeah, we have a comment from Anna. And Anna, first of all, before I even read the comment, I just want to say thank you so much for sharing, because I know that can be really hard in a public group. But a lot of the challenge, some of the challenge that she or they said was thinking about there's just so much to do when you're a case manager and working with somebody, that it can be really overwhelming for the service provider. And also kind of echoing what the report said, Anna also said, I just feel like I also feel like I just don't know enough. And to that, definitely, there's validity to how you're feeling. And also I would argue or just say that you probably know more than you think you do, and to trust yourself and trust the experiences and the things that you do know. But definitely, starting with also that they are excited that they can see what they can weave into the rest of their case management regarding financial security building, which is very exciting for us.
Thank you. Yes, I love that. And yeah, totally feel you. It can be overwhelming. It can be hard to figure out where to start. But I think just naming that you want to try and that you want to incorporate some things and acknowledging what your challenge is super important, because now you know this is specifically what I'm going to need support with. This is specifically the resources I'm going to need to find. Not knowing what you don't know or what you don't feel comfortable with is going to help, you talk to other colleagues about it, come to us and say, hey, FreeFrom, do you have any resources about this or that, or any training on this or that, and so on and so forth. So I definitely feel you and hope that the folks in the chat and us can be supportive. All right, next slide. So what do we do now? So we launched some things to really help continue this conversation. And we know it's going to take a little bit of time for all of us to get comfortable with talking about money, talking about these things, really centering our own survivor experiences and our own relationship to money. But you can become a member of our newest Starting From Within listserv. So we named Sharon, incredible mind over there, came up with the name Starting From Within because this listserv is going to be specifically for sharing stories, resources, asking for support from other service providers who are wanting to create survivor-centered workplaces. So for example, I just realized I'm getting paid way less than my colleagues who are doing the same job. How can I ask for a raise? And then other folks can give you advice on how to do that. Or I need an example of a survivor paid leave policy. Does anybody have one? And then, you can get one of that, and so on and so forth. So you can ask questions, you can share resources like, look, I made this great infographic about how to do a wellness check-in at your next staff meeting, or whatever it is. So this is going to be a great place to continue to create community, but also get support from other service providers who are wanting to specifically focus on creating survivor-centered workplaces. The next is our service provider newsletter. So this is a collection of tips, resources from the FreeFrom team specifically about upcoming webinars that we're doing. Sharon does a really cool, like 3 things to know when you're thinking about having a conversation with a survivor about income or credit or whatever it is. So that's a great little newsletter to get every month and kind of get ideas about what you could do and learning opportunities that are coming up. You can sign up for an upcoming Q&A with FreeFrom and peers. So these are smaller, intimate groups with just service providers on different topics. So past topics have been like student loans. So how can other peers, so other service providers, support each other around student loans, and how you can support clients around student loans. So those happen every month, and every month is a different topic. You could also suggest topics. You could also be invited to lead a peer group. But those are really like almost like support groups, but for service providers on different financial topics. Or you can attend our next webinar for service providers. So the next webinar is going to be specifically on financial security with work with survivors. So for those of you that were like, I have no clue where to start when it comes to doing financial work with survivors, this might be a really good webinar to attend. So that webinar is going to be a combination of the recommendations that we received from the report paired with best practices from FreeFrom, from the work that we've done with survivors and service providers around the space. So it's going to be a great space to really focus in on financial security work. And Sharon is dropping in the survey link so that you can sign up for all these different engagement opportunities, as well as the next webinar. Next slide. Okay, so let's jump into some Q&A. I think folks had questions throughout. So if you have been waiting to get a question answered, please go ahead and type it into the Q&A and we'll answer them live.
We've been having a couple of questions, but one question that I was curious, that Tommaso was curious about was, we talked about unionization at FreeFrom and with different service provider organizations, and that's come up in our kind of conversations outside of the study, but they're wondering, during your survey / discussion with staff for this study, the unionization come up at all? It strikes me that this is one element that separates the DV service workforce from other low and lower wage workforces that are largely comprised of women, frequently women of color, hospitality, janitorial, etc.
I can take that one. That's a really interesting question. And unionization didn't really come up, but I will also say it's not something that we focused on in our surveys or interviews. So it didn't come up, though. Tanya and Sharon, I know that there have been some conversations you've both had with service providers around interest and efforts in unionizing, if you want to share any of those. But we didn't ask focused questions around that as a sort of a possibility or solution just with this specific study.
Yeah, so separately, Sharon and I do a lot of our training and coaching with service providers directly. So I know that in those coaching spaces, folks have asked about unionization. So I don't know if Sharon is comfortable sharing anything, but also, those are really private conversations that we have with service providers, and we will honor that privacy. But I think for sure there is a desire to learn more about unionizing and how that would look like in this space. And I think starting a conversation about it in the listserv is a great idea. And I would love to learn more about, what that would look like for us as service providers.
And thank you so much to everyone who's been in the chat and asking questions all along. We just want to say, don't be shy, even if it's something small. Our favorite part of doing these is really to engage with everyone. I know this has been a lot of information. I know Sharon shared the report. It's very long, but if anybody's got any questions, we would really, don't feel shy. We're excited to answer them and engage with all of you. Also, I'll just go to the next slide. Here are Tanya and I's contact information. So if questions come up that you don't feel comfortable asking in the chat today, or that arise later as you're sort of thinking or reflecting, please feel free to reach out to either of us. Both of us would be so happy to talk through additional questions and things about this report and upcoming resources that Tanya and Sharon have worked hard to put together. So please don't feel shy. We're available here for you after today as well.
Yes, thank you. And if everybody wants to just say, one key takeaway that they're taking from this hour and a half that we shared, if no one has any questions, feel free when you say bye in the chat to just say, this is my key takeaway. Would love to hear if this was helpful or not. And we're also going to get a survey after this that you can submit to give us more feedback on how we can do better in future webinars, but also what you thought about this webinar. All right, so maybe we'll just close up early. Thank you all so much for spending this 1.5 hours. I know we covered a lot of information. Please go out and check out this report. We so much enjoyed sharing virtual space with you, and we hope to see you in our next webinar. All right, bye everybody.